One editorial note before we get into this episode. Since we originally published this episode, the family of David Winecoff reached out to us. They shared critiques of True Believer as a whole and pushed back against what they consider to be incorrect details and stories relayed in this episode. So we've made updates to the version originally published to include notes about those disagreements, as well as some minor edits and additions based on information they provided us. However, we stand by our work and our decision to include an examination of David Winecoff's death in True Believer. He was Elizabeth Mackintosh's pastor and one of the last known people to see her alive in 1990. One of the few pieces of physical evidence found at the crime scene was David's fingerprint on Elizabeth's Knox Seminary acceptance letter. And David's own tragic death had an impact on the investigation into Elizabeth's murder. David's family has released a public statement, which we've linked to in the show notes. We invite you to read their statement, listen to our series, and then decide for yourself about the strength and relevance of this project.
My name is Mike Milton. I'm organizing pastor for Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Overland Park, Kansas. But I didn't get to know David as a colleague, as one pastor to another. But I was actually a seminary student at Knox Theological Seminary, where David served as adjunct professor of homiletics. I had had a seminary course in Kansas City before we moved down to Fort Lauderdale in homiletics. But I found that I didn't know the system. I didn't know the right way, the way that it had to be there, the way that David had learned from Dr. Rayburn some years before. And so I went into David's class, and there I met David for the first time. Let me tell you, he got a hold of me, and for that first semester it was tough. But the years that I spent with David and underneath David's teaching and with David was a wonderful time in my life, and I'll treasure it always, because David had a passion, and David was a skilled man.
That's a clip from the funeral service of Pastor David Winecoff, held on August 24th, 1993. The week before, David died while climbing the Sangre de Cristo mountain range in Colorado. Sangre de Cristo is Spanish for the blood of Christ. Before we get into the circumstances surrounding David's death, which we'll do in the next episode, we need to talk about his relationship with Elizabeth Mackintosh and what he may have known about her death in 1990. David was something of a lightning rod in St. Louis Presbyterian circles, and his death enshrined him as a sort of mythic figure, especially for those who attended his church. But despite his elevated status and the high regard that so many have continued to have for him, many questions remain about his knowledge of and possible connection to the unsolved murder of Elizabeth Mackintosh. This is True Believer, Episode 13, A Skilled Man.
TJ, David Winecoff is one of the really important people in this story, we think. And we're not bringing him up because we necessarily think he's a suspect in the murder. I would be the first to say that I don't think he's a suspect in the murder. But we do think that he knew something important about the murder and about Elizabeth as a person. And in the 3 years between her death and his death, it seems like people did not fully follow up on what he might have known about her death. And so we're discussing all of this now, again, not to reopen old wounds per se, but just to say that, again, he was important to her. We think he is important to this case. And we think that the facts about his death, as painful as they might be, shed important light on this case and about how the church in general and Covenant in particular handled this case.
So first, a little background on David Winecoff. Originally from North Carolina, David came to St. Louis in the late 1970s to attend Covenant Seminary. After graduating, he became an associate pastor at Covenant Presbyterian Church in St. Louis. Then in 1982, Covenant spun off what they call a daughter church, Providence Reformed, which David became the head pastor of. We've heard before from Skip and Bonnie Dusenberry, who were at Covenant Seminary in 1990. They knew Elizabeth and also attended Providence Church, but they had known David Winecoff from before their time in St. Louis.
We met David maybe 10 years before.
Maybe in 77.
Yeah. We were at Clemson from 76 to 80, and during that time, that's when we first met him. Didn't get to know him very well at that point because he wasn't actually in Clemson, but he was nearby. And then they went off, got married, went to seminary and all that. And so when we came there, again, I was going to say, I mean, he was a wonderful preacher, but I think just a wonderful person. I mean, he was very intelligent. Again, I mean, you know, he was a sinner.
People in his church really respected him.
Yeah.
Revered him.
But
he was very loved.
Yeah, but
and
again,
I don't think it's just the glow of the fact that he died at 39. You know, I don't think. I mean, even while we were there, I remember saying to Skip, you know, he really is so admired, respected, loved by the whole congregation. It was a really good situation.
Yeah, and we think rightly so. You know, there can be, you know, and again, it was a relatively small congregation. I can imagine in a really big congregation that it's easy for a pastor to be a rock star. You know, he's up front, and if he's a gifted speaker, and but in a situation like that, people actually rub shoulders and have personal contact with him much more. And I think it would be harder to sort of, you know, pull the wool over people's eyes. And so and again, I mean, you mentioned, I think, TJ, that you didn't realize that I'd been an intern under him. After my first semester, I guess, they offered me the opportunity to be an intern, which I gladly accepted. And I mean, it was an interesting, in a sense, you could say a turnabout of roles. Back in South Carolina, I was a few years older, and I was, in the position of kind of counseling him and his fiancée about marriage. And then, okay, now he's the mentor and I'm the protege. But that worked very well. I think we both genuinely loved and respected each other. And so I didn't chafe, about that. Again, I respected him enough that I appreciated, him as a man.
One memory I have of David that really made an impression, because, he was very gifted and very smart, and it's easy to be proud when you're like that way. But he went away for a trip, and it was the first time he asked Skip to preach at Providence. By God's grace, Skip really hit it out of the ballpark, and it was his first sermon, but everybody was talking about it. And David, he got up in the pulpit when he got home, and he said, all I've heard about since I got back was Skip's message on the seriousness of sin. And he said, I am just so thankful that, I have an intern who I can leave to preach, and I know he'll be faithful. So, it wasn't any kind of...
He didn't seem threatened or...
Right. There was none of that.
Anything.
It was mutual respect and admiration and love.
Here's Chris and Marilyn Baker, who were also at Covenant Seminary and Providence Church at the same time as the Duesenberries, and were good friends of Elizabeth's. Chris was introduced to David Winecoff and Providence Church by Mike, whom we talked about in the last episode.
My background was with the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and when we came to town, we started looking around for different churches, and we had begun attending a church in Chesterfield, and Mike said, well, given your OPC background, you probably might be more comfortable with Providence and Crestwood. And we decided, okay, let's go try it out. And there was a lot about it that was very familiar. It felt a lot like home. The order of worship, the manner of preaching, it was a small church too.
And where they met?
Oh yeah, they met in the Masonic Lodge, and a lot of people freaked out about that. But our OPC church in Northern Illinois met in the Masonic Lodge. I thought, well, that's normal. So that's how we started attending there, and it was, in my case, it was great just for having familiar worship and seeing some of the things that I was learning reinforced in practice. And then bit by bit, as the requirements for school came about, and as I started thinking about requirements for presbytery, I needed an internship. And I spoke with David Winecoff and a couple of the elders, and they agreed to take me on as an intern for about a year.
Providence Church continued to meet in the Masonic Lodge until their new building was completed in 1992. At the time of Elizabeth's murder in 1990, the church was in the middle of a fundraising campaign for their new building. Here's Diane Preston, who knew David Winecoff both from Covenant Seminary and from Covenant Church.
I like David. David thought he knew what everybody needed to do or be. This gives you some idea of how cheeky David was. Jane was 9 months pregnant, out to here, and he preached a sermon and referred to his wife from the pulpit as a beached whale. And I thought, if I were Jane, you would be sleeping in the garage for quite a while. Anyway, he did stuff like that.
We've heard he was sort of an arrogant guy.
Yes, he was. David had a lot of charm, but he was also pretty arrogant.
Do you think he and Liz got along?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think David had encouraged her to look at Knox, but that's hearsay. David was not bashful about sharing his opinion of things, and had very decided opinions. I mean, David and I took a class with Dr. Raymond in 86, maybe? I don't know, somewhere back there on Ephesians, and David was in class with me. So I knew him from church, I knew him from class, and David was in the lead, and whatever David said went. Which is why David and I butted heads more than once. I am not Jane.
Next, we'll hear from Jack Davidson, who was a student at Covenant in 1990. He didn't attend Providence Church, but he knew David Winecoff through ministry work that their churches would sometimes do together.
Well, he was my senior in a way. I mean, he was older. He was the pastor of a church. Providence Church often would reach out to Murphy Blair Community Church, which was the church in the north side, and actually do things in collaboration. We had ministries in the north part of the city, and Providence, Dave and his wife Jane would often be involved in coordinating things that were kind of joint ministry ventures between, this church in the city and this church from the county, that were sort of collaborating on something. So I knew him in that way, and he was very meticulous in his planning and coordinating and, showing up and doing things. I thought about them, the skate park, St. Laborious Church on the north side just burned down recently. It had become a skate park, but it was an old Catholic parish that had been there for years. I remember Murphy Blair Community Church doing a joint music program at St. Laborious and Providence Church coming and helping with that program. So he was very concerned about ministry, not just for Providence Church, but actually doing something in the city. I remember that about him. The other thing I remember about him was that he was very passionate and very exact on his opinions about worship and what proper worship was and wasn't. And in fact, Providence Church would do seminars, if I recall correctly, on worship, just to help all of the churches in Presbytery understand better what was appropriate worship and what, wasn't. So he had very strong opinions on that and could really argue strenuously for those opinions. So he's very strong on the topic of worship. And of course, I remember him as many people do, from the George Stulac heresy trial in the in the early 80s, when George Stulac was a pastor. Pastor Stulac went on trial for heresy in the Missouri Presbytery, and Dave Winecoff and Dr. George Knight were the prosecutors for Presbytery in that trial. And that was a very divisive time in the Missouri Presbytery. And I was what they call a man under care, or a muck, M-U-C, man under care at the time, because I wasn't in seminary yet, but I was wanting to go, and that made quite an impression on me. And David was he was an impressive, a man with a very strong conscience, and very, he made an impression. A very competent pastor. But again, very strong opinions on the regulative principle of Presbyterianism and what worship really was and what was allowable and what was not permissible.
Following David Winecoff's death in 1993, an in memoriam appeared in an issue of the publication Reformed Worship, acknowledging his passion for worship in the Reformed and Presbyterian traditions. It mentions that he was on their advisory committee and that he would give suggestions about what they should publish in their coming editions. Jack also mentioned the trial of Pastor George Stulak, which happened in September 1985. Stulak was accused of holding heretical views on evolution, abortion, and the role of women in the church. It's the PCA, so of course a committee was formed to investigate the accusations, and they recommended that Stulak stand trial before a church tribunal. They also recommended that Stulak resign, but the presbytery voted against that. The investigation committee was led by David Winecoff, and he, along with Covenant professor George Knight, were the two prosecutors in Stulak's trial. However, at the trial, the moderator of the Missouri Presbytery dismissed the charges. So David Winecoff led a group of teaching elders to file a formal complaint against the presbytery at the 1986 General Assembly. The complaint was kicked back down to the presbytery, and that was pretty much the end of that. But the trial and David Winecoff's involvement made a big impression on the PCA community in St. Louis. Before we move on, I want to play a clip from a sermon that David Winecoff preached in August 1990, which will give you some feel for who he was. The sermon, which was the third in a series about the temptation of Jesus in the desert, was titled Control.
So the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh and the pride of life are topics from which the devil brings most of his arguments to our souls. And you see also that he cheats us, because he holds out the kingdoms of the world, he holds out the prospect of control, and he never tells you that it's just an illusion, does he? The illusions of control, when we grasp for it, it brings to us not only lack of control, but misery on top of it. It shouldn't surprise us when great Christians are tempted to awful things, because Satan goes after them. Jesus instantly abhorred the temptation. He didn't wait. He didn't wait minutes. He didn't even wait seconds. He simply abhorred the temptation. He recognized that it was insidiously evil and called it what it was. The suggestion to go and serve other gods in the Old Testament, just the suggestion, was to be made punishable by death. Such a heinous sin it was. If we were to apply that today, it would certainly open up a few positions in most of the theological seminaries, wouldn't it? I can imagine it would open up a whole new area, because in the Old Testament, one after the other would be shown to be servants of Satan, and one after the other would have been stoned to death.
So now let's talk about the week of Elizabeth's murder and what David Winecoff was up to. As we've discussed many times before, Elizabeth had a conversation with David the night before the murder, after the Sunday evening service at Providence Church. David told police that Elizabeth wanted to tell him about her argument with Ruth, the psychotherapist, although it's possible there was more to that conversation that David didn't tell the police about. In the last episode, you heard Detective Scott Worth speculate that Elizabeth may have told David about the secret admirer. The next day, one of the things found in the bathroom at the crime scene was Elizabeth's letter of acceptance to Knox Theological Seminary. When the police tested the letter for fingerprints, they found a match to David Winecoff. What's interesting is that there's actually nothing in the police reports that Ruth and I have had access to that talks about David's fingerprints being found on that letter. My friend Kyle Hackman found out about the fingerprints from a different source many years ago, And then the Cold Justice episode that aired last year talked about it. Presumably, after the police identified David, they would have gone back to him for an explanation of how his fingerprint got on that letter. But there's no record of that, at least not that we've seen. The only correspondence between David and the police, according to the documents that we've seen, is around his 2 phone calls and 1 interview with the police on the day of the murder. The next piece of the story comes from Covenant Seminary's former attorney, Mark Bells, who eventually led Covenant's internal investigation of the murder, starting in May 1990. Back in episode 11, you heard Detective Scott Worth say that he originally got into Elizabeth's case in 2014, after Mark Bells contacted the Creve Coeur Police Department. In February of that year, Detective Worth interviewed Mark at the police station, which we have the case notes about, and then they did a follow-up phone call in 2015, which we have the audio of. When I spoke to Mark Bells earlier this year, he told me much of the same story, but with some additional details. According to Mark, several witnesses described David and Elizabeth's Sunday night conversation as heated, that they were discussing her acceptance letter, and that the letter was being passed back and forth between them. Presumably that's how David's fingerprints would have been on that letter, but again, we don't have confirmation of that in the police reports. Mark also said that a close friend of his, who was attending Providence Church at the time, was told that David and Elizabeth had made plans to meet again, to continue that conversation. But Mark said that the police in 1990 discounted this interaction between David and Elizabeth, and that they couldn't understand what would make anyone so upset about an acceptance letter. He speculated that this was because the police didn't understand the context of the seminary and PCA world, which we've talked about before in this series. Then, 2 days after the murder, Mark Bells claims that David Winecoff called his office. David said to him, "I just want to tell you that Michael absolutely had nothing to do with this murder." And there he's talking about Michael, the prime suspect. Mark responded that the police thought Michael killed Elizabeth. David said, "I know, but he didn't. Just trust me, he had nothing to do with the murder." Mark's brother Tim is also a lawyer who was working with Mark at the same firm in 1990, and when Mark told him about David's call, Tim said, "Oh, that's just David being David. He's an expert on everything." Apparently, David had a reputation of being very opinionated about lots of things. But then 2 days later, David called Mark Bells again. David insisted, implored that Mark somehow get the police off of Michael, because he didn't want Michael fingered for the crime, as Mark described it. "You've got to tell the police that Michael didn't do it," David said. As far as Mark was aware, David had no relationship with Michael. He didn't attend Providence Church. And it wasn't like David was making generalizations. "Oh, Michael couldn't possibly have committed a murder." He was being direct and declarative. Michael did not do it. Unfortunately, Mark never followed up with David about it, or asked him specifically how he knew that Michael didn't do it. Based on the way Mark told the story and the reaction of his brother Tim, it seems like, at the time at least, they didn't take what David was saying very seriously. It's also hard to make sense of Mark's story with what we know David told police on the day of the murder, that 2 different women from his church told him that Michael was Elizabeth's secret admirer. If David was so certain that Michael was innocent, it seems like he would have provided more context to the police during that phone call. But he didn't contact Mark Bells until about 36 hours later. So it's possible David learned something in the meantime that we don't know about. Here's Ruth.
I would say, number one, yes, it's important to ask the question of, why did David Winecoff name a Michael in connection to Elizabeth's murder? And what does that mean about what he knew about what a Michael, non-specifically a Michael, had done? But number two, yeah, of course, it brings up the question of, why did police not follow up on this? So there's 2 separate issues, right? There's like, what did he know? And also, why did nobody follow up on this? And was an opportunity missed in the intervening 3 years when he could have talked about it, to either say, yes, it was a mix-up, I mixed up these 2 people with the same first name, or you misunderstood me. I was right the whole time, and you just didn't care enough to follow up on it. Or maybe a third possibility, he said it, they didn't follow up on it, and he decided not to press the issue. It's hard for me to think of what an additional possibility could be, but I don't know. I wish I could ask anyone involved what happened and why it didn't come up. What do you think?
So many questions with so few answers. This question of David calls Mark Bells and is definitive, declarative. Michael did not kill Elizabeth. But Mark Bells doesn't follow up with him about it. Mark Bells, as far as we know, doesn't tell the police that David was so declarative about this. David doesn't go to the police with this information as far as we can tell. So it just feels like there must be something we're missing here, or is it possible that all these people just were like, shrug, I guess we don't need to talk to the police about this, or everyone thinks the other person isn't very serious, or I just, with the benefit of hindsight, it seems so obvious, like someone should have done something. But maybe if we would have been there, we would have seen there was nothing to do, or it raises more questions than it answers.
100% agree. And you know that I always try and shut down conspiracy theories, right? So the idea that this is a conspiracy theory to me doesn't make sense, because then nobody would have mentioned it in the first place and we wouldn't know about it at all.
Conspiracy meaning like David Winecoff and Mark Bells and someone whose name is Michael are all in on this thing together or something.
That does not and has never made sense to me.
No.
What I often recommend in situations like this is more just that people gossip a lot and talk a lot, but also people are pretty hesitant to take actions about what they talk about. And so it's possible that important information was shared and nobody took action about it. It's also possible that important information was shared and in some sense nobody realized it because they never felt like it was their burden to bear of moving this case forward.
One additional thing to note here, in the Cold Justice episode, the investigator spoke with David's widow, Jane, and she gave an alibi for him on the morning of the murder. She said that he would have been in bed with her on any given Monday morning, although she didn't actually specify that David was in bed with her that particular morning. However, since that episode aired, Jane has said that David definitely, written in all caps, was in bed with her that morning.
In the early years after all of this happened, I would think about it often, and then as time went by, I could tell it was fading deeper into the back of my mind. And I thought, I've learned so much about this that only I have, or a few people know. I'm getting older. So I kind of, with that thought in mind, began sharing it with my family and children, just so that they could preserve some of the details and the truth about what had happened. So this is a great thing that you're taking some steps here to,
That's Norm Reed. He's a graduate from Covenant Seminary, a former member of Providence Reformed Presbyterian Church, and the last person to see David Winecoff alive. Through the rest of this episode and most of the next, you're going to hear Norm's story, not only about the day David Winecoff died, but a lot more about Norm's background, how he met Elizabeth and David, his time at Covenant Seminary, and much more. It might seem like Norm's story is tangential to Elizabeth's murder, or that certain details aren't very relevant, but we think it's important for you to hear the full context of what Norm has to say. His background is important because it helps explain his relationship dynamic with David Winecoff, and why, for so long, he told so few people his story, or at least the full details of his story. Just like with Carl and Kirsten in episode 10, we're mostly just going to let Norm talk. We'll break in occasionally to clarify something, but Norm more or less speaks for himself. Also, you'll hear another voice throughout Norm's interview. That's Ruth's dad, Doug Servin, whom you've heard from before in this series.
Well, I am Norman Reed, and grew up in Arnold, Missouri. Went to Fox High School. Went from there to University of Missouri-Rolla and pursued an engineering degree. My wife lived on a little farm down in St. Genevieve, and Ameren had a power plant there, and I thought, oh, that'd be perfect. We can stay close together before we get married here. And so from there, I moved to the Callaway nuclear plant, and I worked there for many years, and that was very exciting because you're working more with cutting-edge technology instead of an old dusty power plant that was finished 40 years ago. So, and then God got a hold of me, and my wife was Catholic and I was Baptist, and so then began our time of reading the Bible together, and we had our first child, and then having that first child is like, well, we've got to, recommit ourselves here to Christ. We're just kind of hanging loose here, going to a Catholic church one day a month, and then the Baptist church maybe one day every 6 months. And so we prayed and studied together, and my mom, Jean Reed, lived here in St. Louis, and she had joined Providence Presbyterian Church, and she talked very highly of it. So when we would come in to St. Louis on the weekends, we would go to church with her, and that's how I got folded into Providence and the people there, and the rest of it is the story after that. So that's me. There's a lot more warts and wrinkles to go with it, but I'll spare you that. I had, for real, 101 excuses. I was never going to set foot in a seminary. And then just one by one over time, I'd say, well, I'm an engineer, I'm an introvert. I don't go seek out people. I'm not that happy guy all the time. But then people like David Winecoff and others that were at seminary would say, well, Francis Schaeffer was an engineer. I liked Francis Schaeffer. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. And my conversation in my mind kind of with God was, okay, I'm going to do this, and you're going to see I'm a loser, I'll fail, I don't like English, I don't like writing, I don't like history. First class I took was history, evening class. And I looked forward to that evening class more than anything else in my life at the time. And I was just sucking it up, but I still thought, I'm going to fail, everybody around me here is a genius. Well, I got it like an A. I couldn't believe it, And I said, you know what? If I keep taking evening classes, I might get a degree in 15 years, And I don't really want to do that, so how about we just quit and go, And she's like, we'll never sell this house, and what are we going to live on, And I said, well, let's just try. So we put the house up for sale. It wasn't a week. I came home from work, and she's in the driveway crying. I said, what's the matter? She goes, somebody wants to buy our house. So that's how I got to seminary. A little bit of whipping and pushing, and I called it the sheepdogs from heaven had a firm grip on my rear end. So.
And what year did you start at Covenant?
That was, those evening classes were like 89 and 90. The last half of 90, that in September of 90, we went full time. And I basically cashed in my 401k to live for the next 3 years. But I also ended up, and another thing too is I'm waiting in line during admission, and they're using these computers there, and this gal's complaining that they're not working. And I said, well, try hitting this key here. And she goes, really? You know about these? I said, yeah, Ameren trained me for 5 years at Callaway. This is what they use at Callaway. And it started working, and she got on the phone, and she said, I'm calling my boss to tell him, what's your name, So he calls me that evening, no interview or nothing. He says, hi, I'm Bill Lloyd. I need you really, really bad. Will you take the job? And I said, yeah, sure. This is the weirdest job I don't even know what this guy looks like. So then I became a part of the seminary's business department. So, those were some of the best times of our life, but certainly when David died, that was the worst. That was the worst trial I have ever experienced.
So you were taking evening classes 89, 90. Mm-hmm. So you had some overlap with Elizabeth, but had you ever met her, or did you know her in that time?
Well, first of all, my mother was a close friend of hers, and Mom always talked about her. And they were just about the same age, and they had the same interests. She was from Scotland, and my mom wanted to go to Scotland, and my mom embroidered, and my mom was a nurse, and she was a nurse. And so they just really bonded. They were two peas in a pod, basically. Same age, same interests. And Elizabeth, too, was kind of a bold, firecracker type of person, which my mom admired that, because my father had died when I was 7, and my mom had raised the 3 of us by herself, and she kind of learned over time that she was going to have to be bold and firm with people, or they would take her for granted. So yeah, that's how that started. And then there was one of the Sundays that came in for the weekend. She said, I got to introduce you to Elizabeth, and so she took me over to her, and we talked briefly at church. Yeah. And I had told you the story about Bob. Whenever I met Elizabeth, he was sitting behind her, and he was doing this thing with his face. And I asked him later, what was that all about, Bob? It was, that's just kind of, we don't see eye to eye on things. It's just a friendly poking at each other. But anyway, that's how I met Elizabeth. And a couple weeks later, my son was being baptized at our church in Jefferson City. And so my mom had to choose between coming up for that baptism, and she was supposed to go out to a play or something with Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was real eager to tell her something. And that weekend, it was the weekend that she was murdered. And my mom had some survivor guilt over, she wanted to talk to me about something important, and I wasn't there. And she said, go to the baptism. I'll tell you when you get back. And my mom was really broken over it. I mean, everybody was. I went into work that Monday, and if the guy who sits next to me, he would have the Post-Dispatch delivered to his desk. And there it says on the front page, murder at Covenant Seminary. And I haven't told anybody at work that I'm going to go to seminary yet. Boy, I thought, whoa, this is bizarre. So that's how I got to know Elizabeth. Not very long.
Your family was at Providence. Elizabeth was at Providence. David Winecoff was a professor at Covenant. You and Elizabeth were both attending Covenant. Was there a large contingent of people from Providence that were also students at Covenant?
Yes, there was. And David was the pastor at Providence. Now, he had taught a few homiletics classes like a lot of people there do that graduated from Covenant. But at the time, the Covenant was in the middle of a change of leadership, and David was critical of the direction that he thought they were going. So he didn't teach in there anymore after that. But then he began, after the murder, he began to teach at Knox Seminary. And he was working on a PhD from Westminster Seminary.
Can you speak to, so there was this divide at Covenant. He was on one side, the new leadership was on the other side. What was that all about in terms of his stance? What was it about the direction of Covenant that he was opposed to, or why was it that he wanted to go to Knox?
I had a hard time in the beginning understanding what that was about. And I was actually a little turned off just by some of the things that were said, which is kind of typical for a young guy that's coming to seminary, and he's still naive about, there's no sin here. So to hear that kind of stuff, I was kind of like, wow, that's not a very Christian thing to say. But honestly, the best I could discern what was going on was it had something to do with the union between these two denominations, and one was extremely Southern, and one was more affiliated maybe with the OPC, those kind of vibes. And there was these minute little things that they still didn't agree on. And it was, I believe, Covenant Seminary, the way I understand it, was part of the Evangelical Presbyterian Church in North America at the Union time. And most of the complaining I heard was that the Southern Church had joined with them just to suck the seminary away from them and make it bigger and better and to take control of it. So it really sounded to me like some kind of turf war.
And David was outspoken about that?
Very, he was he was outspoken. He was very loyal to the president at the time was Rayburn.
Robert Rayburn.
Robert Rayburn.
Before Koistra.
Yeah, he was very, very loyal. And
what type of guy was David Winecoff?
Dave was a very, he was bold too, and even radical in the sense that he wasn't afraid to challenge anybody to live their Christianity outside their comfort zone. And he didn't care who they were or what their position was. He wasn't afraid to speak or teach on subjects that were going to rile people up. And for example, it was some point before I got there that a number of Covenant Seminary students, at the prompting supposedly of Francis Schaeffer, they did some kind of sit-in or protest at some kind. It was either a government institution or maybe a hospital institution. I believe it was about abortion, but it was so long ago, I can't even, that goes to show you how these things turn out. You can't even remember what the issue was. And there was a number of Covenant Seminary students that went, and they got arrested, and it was in the news. But even afterwards, David would publicly call out some of the professors, why didn't you show up? And, one of those professors had told me privately that he said, he loved David, but he said he was the most arrogant student, he said. This was a student, he's the most arrogant student I'd ever had in my life. And that's really how the more mature staff there were. They weren't afraid to say, yeah, he's a pistol, but I love him anyway. But that's the kind of guy David was. So he became kind of a lightning rod for complaints, and people either loved him dearly or hated him. And I didn't know about the hate part but I often heard David say derogatory things about some of his classmates that he had been there, that they were, like, Brian Chappell had taken over the homiletics department. And, David would say, well, Brian's just regurgitating everything he learned from Rayburn. And there's plenty of people can do a better job than that. It sounded like jealousy to me, but there were some times when David would have kind of say things that he regretted. He said, I regretted doing that, and I heard the story about it, how he had said he was sorry to Paul Koistra later after this big campaign to stop his being made the president of Covenant Seminary. So I saw David grow some, but man, if he got fired up about something, even in a sermon, he'd say some things that probably be okay to say, to your friends, but not from the pulpit. But that's what he was. He had no fear, basically. So.
Did he ever do that to you personally?
Only one time, the Koistra incident came back on me one day when this was a couple of years I'd been a student there, and I had gained his trust, and because we were climbing together and doing things together and praying together. So he made the comment one day that he would, at church, there was a conference going on at Covenant Seminary, and they had invited 3 guest speakers, and most of them were what you'd call big hitters, like it might have been Sinclair Ferguson or Alistair Begg or somebody, some big names in. But Paul Koister was also on the list of people that were going to be presenting. So he made the comment, boy, it'd be really great if we could get one of those guys to come and preach Sunday night here. And I said, well, I work in the department. I see these guys every day. You want me to do that for you? I'll do it. He says, yeah, see what you can do. So the first person I talked to was Dr. Koistra, with no idea that there was this bad blood between them. Didn't understand it, didn't want to. And so I went back to David, and Dr. Koistra looked at me. I remember him sitting at his desk, it's just this blank look on his face, and he pauses and he goes, yeah, I'll do it. So I went back to David and I said, I took care of that for you. He said, okay, who's coming? And I said, Dr. Koister. And he goes, what? You know, he was like, oh no, I'm in trouble. So he goes, we, you know, he starts stuttering. He says, you're going to have to go back and say, you know, we can't do it. And I was annoyed. I thought, I stuck my neck out for you and got him to speak. And now you're telling me to. So again, you know, I went back to Dr. Koister again, sitting across the desk. And I said, well, you don't need to preach on Sunday night. And it was the same kind of blank look. And he goes, I understand. So that was the one time I got rebuked. Another one was, there was this Bible study he was doing in the evenings at a church downtown, because we were trying to arrange our schedules when we would train together for climbing again. But I was also being mentored by him in my desire to be a minister, I guess you'd say, or whatever. So he says, well, I got a Bible study that night down in this downtown in St. Louis. I said, really? And he said, do you mind if I would come along for this? And he got really kind of overexcited and he frustrated and angry, kind of like he did before. He started stammering and stuttering and going, oh, no, no way. And I go, well, I'm going to be doing this someday. And other students tag along for this kind of stuff all the time. What's the problem? He goes, oh, well, they're new believers. And I went, oh, new believers. I guess I'll never, ever have to come across new believers. He goes, well, and he was getting angrier. He says, well, it's dangerous. It's just dangerous, you know. And he was getting so mad, I just gave up. So I dropped it.
Why didn't he want you to go?
He didn't really say. I didn't.
Where was he going?
It was a church downtown, and so I didn't know enough about the area really to have any kind of judgmental thoughts about why, other than, wow, these are radical unbelievers. You know, maybe it's a gang or something. So I just dropped it.
So when he said dangerous, he meant like physically, like that it was a dangerous area to be going to?
I don't know. We didn't go into it. He shunned me enough that I just shut up and changed the subject.
You also mentioned to me a couple of times when you talked with David, or David overheard you talking about Michael as a suspect.
Yeah. There was 2 times. The first time was when we were in his car driving back from one of our climbing training sessions, and we would chit-chat about stuff. And so I just cold turkey asked him, so Dave, do you think Michael did it? Or no, I started with, who do you think did it? I wanted to ease into it. And as I started to ask that question, Dave, all of a sudden, his demeanor changed and he got real nervous, kind of fidgety. And I turned my head, I was in the passenger seat, so I turned to look at his face, and a tick started in his cheek right here, which to me always was a sign of stress in a person. It wasn't there before. And it was so pronounced that at that moment, I could tell he was aware that I was aware of it. And so he turned his head to the left really hard, so I couldn't see it. And I thought I'd already seen it. And then I said, well, I can't remember. I could have said something about Michael before the twitch. I probably did. It's been so long ago. But I said, well, do you think Michael did it? And he goes, no, I don't think he did it. Then there was a second incident in the back of the church when I was talking to one of the deacons, And that weekend in the Post, a story had come out where Dr. Koistra, it was like a follow-up on the murder, and Dr. Koistra had publicly said, and they quoted him in the paper, him saying, "I don't believe Michael did it." So me and the deacon were talking about this in the back of the church, and David was like 20 feet away greeting people at the door. I didn't think he heard what we were talking about. But when he was done, he kind of ambled over and he said, "Michael didn't do it." And me and the deacon were like kind of stunned the way he had said it, like he knew Michael didn't do it. And I looked at Dave and I said, "What do you mean by that? What do you mean Michael didn't do it?" And he goes, oh, I mean what Dr. Koistra said. You know, I agree with Dr. Koistra. I don't think Michael did it. So, but he stayed pretty calm at that moment. It was the one in the car that got me. The one in the car was very similar to the, can I go on the Bible study? And he just like started freaking out.
Here, we want to reiterate that the family of David Winecoff disagrees with Norm's impressions of David's behavior and responses to being asked about Elizabeth's murder.
Okay, you've mentioned climbing now, so can we get into climbing?
Yeah, maybe a year into our time after I'd become a full-time student. I'm not sure how he found out, but I had been an avid climber in Missouri, to the point where people had written my name in some books and stuff, and somehow he found this out, and he had a kind of a romantic view of adventure and climbing, and so he all of a sudden said, "Hey, will you show me how to climb? Will you take me climbing with you?" And I said, "Sure. There's a couple other guys here at the church that want to go too, so let's just pick a day, and I'll take you around Missouri and Illinois and show you the ropes, so to speak." And ironically, one of those guys was Chris Baker.
Here's Chris Baker talking about the times that he went climbing with Norm.
One of the things that Norm would do is, if you go out to the outer road just south of Covenant's campus, they had built a stone wall in order to get the outer road stable and to allow the low ground to be what it was. And we would go and practice by climbing along that stone wall, the retaining wall. We would do that. And then one time we went to Southern Illinois. In Southern Illinois, you've got sandstone rock faces. And there was a place that Norm knew about that we went and we climbed there and learned, belaying and making sure you had good handholds and whatever. I didn't climb very high. I mean, you're talking maybe we were climbing a 150-foot rock face. That was about it.
Sounds pretty high to me.
Me too. I don't remember him doing this at all. I don't remember that.
And were you interested in climbing separately, or Norm was like, "Hey, I'm going to go climbing. Anybody want to go?" And you decided to go along with him. What was your connection?
Well, they were
to
our neighbors. They lived at seminary too, Norm and Mary.
I don't know. There was some romance about it. I'm going to go be a man. I'm going to go climb a rock.
Yeah.
I really think it was something like that. But Norm talked about it with a sort of a zeal, and I thought, yeah, I'd be willing to try that.
Well, he was an expert, right? He was like,
he loved it.
Yeah.
And so it was just an attempt. But I don't know. I didn't get into it further. I think that was the last true climbing effort I made, is going to that rock wall in Southern Illinois. I don't even know where it was.
Here's Norm again, talking about his internship at Providence Church and how he started climbing with David Winecoff.
I wasn't a paid intern. I was kind of looked at, you got the juicy job at the seminary, and they didn't have it in their budget. So I would get tasks like any other intern to teach, Sunday school or vacation Bible school. And so we began to climb together, and he was really into it and kind of gung-ho about it, and that's kind of how that started. That year that he died, August of '93, he would come to me and say, "We need to do a big adventure together," and privately I didn't think he was ready for that. Man, he had the zeal, but he just wasn't ready. He didn't have all the experience. And
Meaning he just didn't know enough about climbing or hadn't had enough hours in it to know how to handle, because it's a potentially dangerous situation that you're in.
But it also takes a higher level of endurance than the average person might have. So my advice to him was, well, you need to start hiking more, you need to start carrying some weight in your pack, and we need to go climbing more. You need to build up your forearms, and you need to learn the procedures, the safety procedures of how you tie knots, and you check each other's. You have redundant safety pieces. You check them both, and you check each other. And then we had word signals. Had to learn all that stuff. So, and it's just practice. So I started climbing with him more and more until we got up to that year that he died. Before the General Assembly meeting that year, he came up with a plan and it was somewhere in the South. I think it was Atlanta, but he had a plan that we go a week early, and he would take, with my family, his family combined, we went to this camp he used to work at when he was younger, a Christian camp, and because we could camp there for free in a cabin. And nearby were climbing opportunities, in particular a place called Looking Glass Rock in North Carolina. So the plan was we would go climbing during the day, while the kids and the ladies enjoyed the camp. And so we did. We climbed 4 different days while we were there. But the last day, we climbed 3 times at Looking Glass Rock. And on the last day, we did an easy climb, and it was what's called a 2-pitch climb. So you had to climb up 2 rope lengths, which puts you about 300 or 400 feet above the ground. And if you've ever seen Looking Glass Rock, it's kind of an icon from the Blue Ridge Highway, but it's a curved granite wall. So when we finished our climb, there's what's called rappel routes, and a rappel route has bolted anchors in the rock, and what you do is you have to have 2 ropes because it's such a long rappel. You take your 2 ropes and you tie the ends of the ropes together, you feed them through the ring, you tie a knot on the end so you don't go off the end. And this is what he needed to, one of the most important things he needed to learn was all these procedures. So when we finished our climb, there we were on the side, 300 feet up. I rigged the ropes up for our rappel, told him, what to expect, and I even had him hook his rappel device into the rope before I left, just so he wouldn't make a mistake, because it was the first time he'd ever done one like this. And I told him, I have to go first because the ropes can get tangled on the way down, and you'll need to know how to deal with that. If you don't know how to deal with it, you could freak out or something. So I rappelled down and to a pretty comfortable ledge. It had 2 more new anchors on it. And first you hook into the anchors, you unhook your rope, and then you yell up to the guy, off rappel. So, and that's a signal that now it's time for him to hook his carabiner into the rappel device, and then to just do what I did on the way down. For some reason, it was taking him a long, long time to do that, way more time than it should have. And I kept saying, everything okay? And because the rock was curved, I couldn't see him. It was just enough of a curve. It's like the surface of the ocean, when a ship sails away. And it was like 20, 25 minutes. And finally, he says, okay, I'm ready. He says, I'm rappelling. And I'm watching the 2 pieces of rope that are coming down side by side with the knot tied. They're both tied together at the bottom. And one of the ropes, I remember even exactly, it was the left one. The left one starts moving downward while the right one's moving upward. And that is never, ever supposed to happen. And when I tied the ropes together, I left like 3 feet with a double back up. I called it a Carmen knot just for fun. So I knew that if those ropes moved more than 3 feet, something bad was going to happen. So I started yelling up to him, stop, stop, stop. And he goes, why? And I said, something's wrong, something's wrong. He says, no, there's nothing wrong. And I said, yeah, there's something wrong. That's something really wrong. Go back up there and just sit down and wait for me. And so I basically free solo climbed back up. I had the rope on, but I didn't trust it anymore. And the climbing was For me, it was easy, super easy. I wasn't worried about it. And then by the time I got up to him, because of the curve, you know, you're just on like maybe a 30 degree, it's nothing. But I get up there, I look at the knot, and it has been untied. This is a double figure 8 knot. You use a figure 8 knot for one of the reasons is they don't come undone. And, you know, there's a figure 8 loop in the one rope, and then the other rope, a single piece of rope is going through one of the loops, and it is slid out to the point where there's like 3 inches left, and it's going to just come loose. And he would have gone just flying by me 100 miles an hour. And I got sick to my stomach. I was like, why did you do that? And he goes, well, my webbing was tangled in it. And he had told me that when I asked him what was wrong. And I said, but I told you just to leave it. It would come down with the rope. I had it set up that way that when you pull the rope down, it would pull everything with it. And he's like, oh, I'm sorry, you know. And we both have children waiting for us back at the camp, you know. And that was the moment that I was so filled with doubt. Something just wasn't right. Either everything I knew about David in his public life, he was intelligent, he was smart, he was careful, he loved his family. But what I had witnessed there was so radically different than anything I'd ever seen a person do before. I had to assume that he just got so freaked out, he panicked or whatever, and then thought he could fix it himself. I didn't know what to think.
Because the only possible way for those knots to come undone is if he did it intentionally.
Yeah.
It's impossible for it to have come undone by itself.
I said to him, what did you do? And he said, well, I untied the knot to untangle the other piece of gear, and then I put the knot back together. And I said, no, you didn't. That's when I thought, I mean, a simpleton would have been able to look at that knot and know that it was not safe. And in my mind I was thinking, is he really that off, you know? I mean, because I was conflicted really bad about what I had just witnessed. And so we eventually made it down.
At that time, immediately in that moment, did you have the thought that you thought it might have been possible that he did it on purpose?
Yeah, I did, but because of the high respect I had for him, I just could not let myself really buy into that yet. I didn't know what to think.
But you considered not ever climbing with him ever again?
I did. And one of the guys that we had climbed with at our church, I told him about it. And he just laughed, you know, because he thought David was kind of goofy anyway, so. And he was an intern too.
Okay, so what happens? So that happens.
That happens.
You do go climbing again. What happens in between?
That was supposedly the last day we were going to climb together before General Assembly. So the plan was then that he was going to go on to General Assembly with his family, and I was going to go on to General Assembly with my family. But I told Mary what had happened, and I said, I cannot go to General Assembly. I just can't. So we kept driving and went to the beach, basically.
Good plan.
Yeah.
But you do go climbing with him again after that.
Okay, he came to me with a climbing magazine and said, I want to do this, and it was an article about this new remote place in Colorado. And in my mind, I thought, there is no way that we're going to go to this place. And so I kind of politely reasoned with him and said, well, the altitude there is going to sap your strength. What we need to do is go to a intermediate place, camp there a couple days, get used to the altitude, and that was going to be the Crestone Needle. That was the warm-up, and it was a climb that, like I said, it was high altitude, but it was like walking up a hill, basically.
It wasn't super difficult. Technically.
Right. It wasn't. But still, I was so worried. My wife was worried. And the night before we left, my wife and I are laying in bed together talking, and she's got a grip on me, and she's worried, and she goes, "Why don't you just cancel it?" And I said, "I don't know how to. He's been looking, he intimidates me, he had that kind of personality." And I said, "What I'm going to do, Mary, is I'm going to stay with him. I'm going to stay in front of him the whole way up. I'm going to watch him like a hawk, and I am not going to let him get away from me ever." That was the plan.
In this episode, we've heard from many people about the kind of person that David Winecoff was, what he may have known about Elizabeth's murder, and how Norm had serious concerns about David following their climbing incident in May 1993. It turned out that Norm's concerns were valid. We'll hear about what happened next on that mountain in Colorado, how the fallout stayed with Norm for the rest of his life, and the connection between David Winecoff's death and how Covenant Seminary handled the memory of Elizabeth Mackintosh. Next time. True Believer is written, recorded, edited, mixed, and executive produced by TJ Ingracia. Co-written and co-produced by Ruth Servin Smith. Research and development by Kyle Hackman and Doug Servin. Visit TrueBelieverPodcast.com to see additional materials related to each episode, or to get in touch with us. If you're someone who knew Elizabeth or have any information related to her or her murder, we'd love to hear from you. Next time on True Believer.
I turn to look ahead, and I hear a whisper, and he says, "Norm." And I look back, and our eyes meet. And he looks me in the eye, and he says, "I'm not going to make it." And he lets go. I didn't want to tell, even on the way out that day, I was thinking, I can't tell anybody this, but this is too much, this is too big a load for me. So as soon as I got back to the seminary, I had an appointment with Brian Chappell, and I told him what I saw and what happened. I don't want to think about it anymore. I've jokingly said to some people, if I could get a very precise lobotomy done, I would have all this wiped out of my head and just move on. But it's not going to happen.